I was 36 years old when my therapist asked me a question that changed everything. After 6 months of sessions, she leaned forward and said, "Have you ever noticed that you don't have your own opinions? That everything you think is exactly what your mother would think?" I was floored. Of course, I had my own opinions. But when she asked me to name just one thing I believed in that my mother disagreed with, I completely blanked. I couldn't think of anything, nothing. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't me. I was an emotional photocopy of my mother, a perfect psychological clone. And it took 36 years for me to discover that I didn't exist as a separate person. Carl Jung called this the death of the process of individuation, and it's one of the most cruel forms of narcissistic abuse a parent can inflict on a child. Today, I'm going to explain exactly how narcissistic parents create emotional clones, how they systematically erase a child's identity and replace it with a copy of themselves, and how this process destroys the child's ability to become a real individual. If you've always felt like you don't know who you are, if all your opinions seem borrowed, if you look in the mirror and see someone else looking back, pay attention, because this might explain your entire life. What Jung discovered about emotional clones. Carl Jung dedicated decades studying what he called the process of individuation. It's the natural development of the true self. The journey from a totally dependent child to an adult with their own identity, their own opinions, their own values. In healthy families, parents function as mirrors. They reflect back to the child who they are. When a 3-year-old says, "I like blue," the healthy parent says, "You like blue." This simple validation confirms you exist, your preferences are real, your identity is forming. But in narcissistic families, the opposite happens. The parent doesn't function as a mirror. They function as a mold, and the child isn't seen as a separate person developing. They're seen as clay that needs to be shaped into the exact form the parent wants. Jung described this as the catastrophic failure of the maternal or paternal function. Instead of nurturing the emergence of the child's true self, these parents systematically destroy it and replace it with a miniaturized version of themselves. And the child, who desperately needs the love and approval of their parents to survive, unconsciously collaborates with their own destruction. They abandon who they are to become who their parents need them to be. How it begins. The 3 stages of emotional cloning. The creation of an emotional clone doesn't happen all at once. It's a process that unfolds in predictable stages, and the earlier it starts, the more complete the destruction of the true self. Stage 1. Selective erasure, 0 to 5 years old. This is where it all begins. The child naturally starts to express individual preferences. They like yellow, not pink. They want to play with trucks, not dolls. They're quiet and introspective, not extroverted and social. In the narcissistic family, each of these expressions of individuality is systematically punished or ignored, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle and devastating way. The narcissistic mother hears her daughter say, "I like yellow," and responds, "No, honey, you like pink. Pink is your color." Or worse, she simply ignores the statement completely, as if the child hadn't spoken. The narcissistic father sees his son playing quietly alone and says, "Stop being so antisocial. Go play with the other kids." The implicit message, who you naturally are, is wrong. It needs to be corrected. Jung explained that in this phase, the child is still forming the basic sense of self. They don't yet have the psychological structure to resist, so they simply bury the parts of themselves that aren't accepted. Let me tell you about Emily. At 4 years old, she loved to draw. She spent hours drawing imaginary animals with vibrant colors. But her mother only paid attention when Emily played house, imitating her own mother. Within 6 months, Emily stopped drawing completely. Not because anyone forbade it, but because she internalized the message. This part of me is not loved, so this part needs to die. At 31 years old, Emily was in my office describing how she felt empty, how she didn't know what she liked or who she was. When I asked about childhood hobbies, she was silent for 3 whole minutes. She couldn't remember anything that was just hers. Stage 2. Forced replacement, 6 to 12 years old. After systematically erasing the child's true self, the narcissistic parent begins phase 2, installing a version of themselves in its place. This is where the direct programming begins. The child is repeatedly told what they think, what they feel, what they want, not as suggestions, but as established facts about their identity. You're shy, you don't like sports, you love math. You're exactly like I was at your age. These statements are repeated hundreds, thousands of times, until the child can no longer distinguish between what is true about them and what has been implanted. Jung called this projective identification. The parent projects their own identity, their own values, their own unfulfilled ambitions onto the child. And the child, without a self strong enough to resist, simply absorbs everything. Michael was 8 years old when his father, a frustrated lawyer who always wanted to be a doctor, started saying, "You're going to be a doctor. You love science. It's your dream." It wasn't Michael's dream. Michael loved music, but every time he mentioned music, his father changed the subject or became visibly disappointed. When Michael said anything about medicine, his father lit up, gave him total attention, approval. Within 2 years, Michael was telling everyone that he wanted to be a doctor. He genuinely believed it, because the alternative was unbearable, accepting that his father never loved him for who he really was. At 27 years old, Michael was in his 3rd year of medical school, having daily panic attacks. He told me, "I don't know why I'm doing this. I hate every second of it. But when I think about stopping, I feel like I'm going to die." Because stopping would be admitting that he'd spent 20 years living someone else's life. It would be facing the emptiness where his true self should be. Stage 3. Solidification and automation. Adolescence. In adolescence, something devastating happens. The emotional clone becomes automatic. The child no longer needs the physical presence of the parents to continue erasing themselves. They've internalized the narcissistic parent completely. Jung described this as the formation of a dominant parental complex. It's an internal psychological structure that continues the work of our parents, even when they're not physically present. It's like an inner voice, constantly policing any emergence of our true self. Adolescence should be the phase where individuation accelerates, where young people naturally rebel, experiment with identities, and form their own opinions. It's the natural laboratory for the formation of the self, but an emotional clone cannot individuate because any movement toward a separate identity triggers deep panic. The child has internalized that being different from their parents means losing their love, and losing their love is psychologically equivalent to death. So instead of individuating, the cloned adolescent becomes even more rigid, even more like their parents. While their peers are experimenting with different clothes, different music, different ideas, the clone is becoming an increasingly perfect replica. The 4 mechanisms of cloning. Carl Jung identified 4 specific psychological mechanisms that narcissistic parents use, usually completely unconsciously, to create emotional clones. Mechanism 1. Denial of otherness. Otherness is the concept that another person is fundamentally separate from you. that they have their own inner life, their own experiences, an essence that you can never fully possess or control. Healthy parents recognize their children's otherness from an early age. They see the baby as a separate person who is gradually revealing themselves. They're curious about who this child is becoming. Narcissistic parents cannot tolerate otherness. To them, the child is not a separate person. They're an extension of themselves, an object that exists to serve their emotional needs. This manifests in 1,000 subtle ways. The mom who says, "I know exactly what you're feeling." "No, you don't. Mom, you're projecting." The dad who says, "You think exactly like me." No, he doesn't. He's been trained to echo you. The repeated message is, "You are not separate from me. Your thoughts are my thoughts. Your feelings are my feelings. Your life is an extension of my life." And the child, hearing this every day for years, eventually believes it. They stop trying to figure out who they are separately because they've been taught that separation doesn't exist. Mechanism 2. Punishment of differentiation. Whenever the child tries to express difference, individuality, separation, there are consequences. Not necessarily physical punishment, but devastating, emotional punishment, withdrawal of affection, disapproval, visible disappointment, sometimes explosive rage, sometimes something worse, complete indifference, as if the child has ceased to exist. The daughter says, "I think differently than you about this." "Mom." The mother becomes cold, distant, withdraws affection for days. The message, difference leads to abandonment, conformity leads to love. The son says, "I want to pursue a different path than what you chose for me, Dad." The father becomes devastatingly silent, or explodes in anger, or worse, says coldly, "Then you're no longer my son." This punishment doesn't need to happen often. 2, 3 experiences like that, and the child learns the lesson deeply. Being yourself is dangerous. Agreeing is safe. So they stop differentiating and start actively and automatically molding themselves into the shape that their parents approve of. Mechanism 3. Reward of imitation. The opposite is also true. Whenever the child imitates their parents, reflects back their opinions, acts like a miniaturized copy, there are massive emotional rewards: warm attention, radiant approval, visible love. The child feels, perhaps for the first time, that they are completely accepted, completely safe, but they don't realize that they're being loved, not for who they are, but for how well. They're playing the role of clone. The mother says, "You're exactly like me. We're so alike." And the daughter feels a wave of warmth, of connection. She doesn't understand yet that she's being loved for her absence of individuality. The father says, "You think exactly right, just like I taught you." And the son feels pride, validation. He doesn't know that he's being praised for his psychological obedience, not for his essence. So the child, like any intelligent organism, continues doing what generates reward. They continue erasing themselves and conforming because it produces the only thing they desperately need, the sensation of being loved. Mechanism 4. Gaslighting of identity. Perhaps the most insidious mechanism is the constant gaslighting about the child's own internal reality. The child says, "I feel sad." The father responds, "No, you're not sad. You're just tired." The child says, "I didn't like that food." The mother responds, "Of course you liked it. You always like it." The child says, "I want to be an artist." The father responds, "No, you don't. You want financial security. Being an artist isn't realistic." Each of these interactions is a micro-invalidation of the child's internal reality. And when this happens, hundreds of times, the child stops trusting their own perception. They develop what Carl Jung called alienation from the self. They no longer know what they really feel, think, want, because they've been taught that their internal perception is unreliable, that their parents know better who they are than they do themselves. And that's where the cloning is completed, because now the child not only imitates their parents externally, they literally don't have access to any other source of identity. Drastum, the result, the adult clone. What happens when these children grow up? They become what I call ghost adults. People who seem to function normally, but who carry a devastating void where the self should be. Externally, they're often successful because they've been programmed to achieve the goals that their parents projected onto them. They pursue the right careers, marry the right people, live the right lives. But internally, there's a deafening emptiness, a constant feeling of living someone else's life, of watching their own life happen instead of living it. Let me describe the 5 most common symptoms that I see in adults who were emotional clones. Symptom 1, inability to make independent decisions. Simple decisions become paralyzing. What to eat for dinner, what movie to watch, what clothes to buy. Because these decisions require access to the true self, to one's own preferences, and that self was erased decades ago. So the adult clone constantly asks others what to do. What do you think? What would you choose? They're desperately looking for someone else to fill the void where their own opinions should be. And bigger decisions like changing careers, ending relationships, moving to a different city, become impossible without external approval, usually from your parents. Even when the adult is 40, 50 years old. Symptom 2, parasitic relationships. The adult emotional clone, without access to their own self, needs another person to function as a temporary substitute for their identity. They enter relationships and immediately absorb the personality of their partner. They start listening to the same music, holding the same opinions, adopting the same hobbies, not because they genuinely like them, but because they have nothing of their own to offer. And when the relationship ends, they completely collapse, because they haven't just lost a partner. They've lost the temporary structure that was functioning as a substitute self. It's like having your foundation ripped away. Symptom 3, chronic existential emptiness. There's a constant feeling of emptiness, that something fundamental is missing, as if there's a hole in the center of your existence that nothing can fill. It's that deep-seated, nagging feeling that something is just off. This emptiness is the space where the true self should be, and no amount of external success, relationships, possessions, experiences can fill it. Because all of these things are experienced through a false self that was installed by the narcissistic parent. The adult emotional clone often describes life as colorless, flat, like watching TV instead of living. Because in fact, they aren't living their own life. They're running a program that was installed decades ago. Think of it like living on autopilot, going through the motions, but never truly feeling alive. Symptom 4, inability to know what you want. This is perhaps the most painful manifestation. The adult emotional clone literally doesn't know what they want, not in big decisions, nor in small decisions. Do you want to go to the movies or out to dinner? Whatever. Which do you prefer? I don't know. What's your dream? Paralyzed silence. Because wanting something requires access to your true self, requires contact with authentic desires. And this contact was systematically destroyed in childhood. So the adult lives an entire life of whatever, an existence of perpetual passivity, waiting for someone to tell them what to do, because the internal voice that should be guiding them is completely silenced. It's like navigating life without a compass, constantly adrift and unsure of which direction to take. Symptom 5. Panic. When confronted with freedom. Paradoxically, the adult emotional clone often fantasizes about freedom, dreams of moving away from their parents, of following a completely different path, of finally doing what they want. But when freedom actually appears, when the parents pass away, or they move to another city, or they finally have the resources to choose, something terrible happens, absolute panic, because freedom requires a self to make choices, and they don't have one. So instead of liberation, they feel imminent disintegration, as if they're going to disappear completely without the external structure defining who they are. It's like being thrown into the deep end of the pool without knowing how to swim, and often they run back, literally or psychologically, to the family prison. Because at least there they know who they are expected to be. It's a twisted comfort zone, a familiar cage that, despite its limitations, provides a sense of security. How to recognize if you are an emotional clone. There are 3 questions that function as a diagnostic tool. If you answer yes to 2 or more, it's very likely that you were raised as an emotional clone. First, can you name opinions of yours that are fundamentally different from your parents' opinions? Core values, deep beliefs, life choices. If you freeze on this question, that's a giant red flag. Second, when you make an important decision, is the voice in your head yours or your parents'? If it's predominantly their voice, you're operating through an installed program, not through an authentic self. It's like being a puppet, with your parents pulling the strings of your thoughts and actions. Third, have you ever had the feeling of living someone else's life? This feeling of disconnection, of watching your own life from the outside, is one of the most revealing symptoms of emotional cloning. It's the eerie sensation of being a spectator in your own story, observing the events unfold without truly being present. The way back. How to recover the true self. Jung deeply believed that the true self never completely dies, no matter how completely it has been buried. It's there, dormant, waiting to emerge, but the recovery process isn't easy, it's not fast, and it requires facing one of the deepest fears a human being can feel, the fear of existing separately from the people who created us. Let me describe the process in 4 phases. This isn't just theory. It's the roadmap I've seen dozens of people follow to escape emotional cloning and start living as real individuals. Phase 1. The painful awakening. Recovery always begins with a moment of awakening. Often it's a breakdown, a panic attack, an existential crisis, a sudden and overwhelming feeling that you cannot continue living like this. For Emily, it was at 33 years old. She had just been promoted to manager at a bank. It was exactly the position her father had always said she should aspire to. But on the day of the promotion, instead of joy, she felt terror. She called me 2 hours later. In a panic, "I don't want this. I never wanted this. I don't know what I want, but it's not this. Who am I?" This awakening is painful because it comes with devastating realizations. Realizing that you've spent decades living someone else's life. That the people who should have loved you for who you are actually loved a fabricated version. That you collaborated in your own destruction. The temptation in this phase is to recede, to say you were exaggerating, that everything is fine, that you are happy, to return to the comfortable sleep of conformity. It's like hitting the snooze button on your own life, delaying the inevitable confrontation with the truth. But if you can tolerate the pain, if you can stay with the realizations, something begins to change. A small voice, very quiet, starts to speak. It's the voice of your true self, and it's furious. Phase 2, grief and rage. When you begin to perceive the extent of what was done to you, two massive emotions appear: grief and rage. Grief for the childhood you didn't have, for the person you could have been, for the years lost living on autopilot, for the fundamental betrayal of being treated as an object, not as a person. And rage. Rage at the parents who did this. Rage at yourself for having collaborated. Rage at the world that didn't notice, didn't intervene, didn't save you. This phase scares many people, especially emotional clones, who were trained to never express anger, especially toward their parents. But Jung was clear. Rage is absolutely necessary, because rage is the emotion of self-protection. It's the true self finally saying, "This was not right. I didn't deserve this. I am separate. I matter." Michael spent 8 months in this phase. 8 months of intense rage, revisiting childhood memories with new eyes. Seeing for the first time how each expression of individuality was systematically crushed. He told me, "I always thought my parents were perfect, that the problem was with me. Now I see that they destroyed me, and didn't even realize it, because they were so trapped in their own narcissism, they never saw me as a real person." That realization is liberating, but also terrifying, because now you have to rebuild everything from scratch. Phase 3, experimentation and discovery. This is where the real work begins. You have to discover who you are, and the only way to do that is to experiment. Jung called this phase confronting the possibilities of the self. You have to try things, many things. Most won't resonate, some will, and slowly you begin to perceive patterns, preferences, an authentic voice emerging. As Carl Jung wisely stated, the process of individuation requires delving into the unknown aspects of our personalities. For emotional clones, this phase is paralyzing at first, because they don't even know where to begin. Their entire lives have been programmed. How do you discover what you like when you've never been allowed to like anything? The answer is, you start small, ridiculously small. Emily, started with food. For 38 years, she ate what her mother ate, liked what her mother liked. So she started experimenting, one new flavor per week, documenting her real reactions, not what she thought she should feel. She discovered she hated coffee, despite drinking it daily for 20 years, because her mother said she loved coffee. She discovered she loved sushi, which she'd never tried, because her mother said she wouldn't like it. Seems trivial, but it's not. Each small, authentic discovery is a cell of the true self being rebuilt. You do this with everything: music, movies, clothes, hobbies, ideas, values. Slowly, patiently, you begin to discover who you are when you're not trying to be the projection of another person. And something wonderful starts to happen. You start to feel substance, weight, reality, like you're finally inhabiting your own body, your own life. Phase 4, confrontation and separation. Eventually, if you're doing the work, you have to confront the parents, not necessarily in a dramatic way, but somehow you have to establish that you are separate, that your opinions, choices, life are yours. For some, this means a direct conversation. For others, it means simply starting to live differently and tolerating the disapproval. For some, It means minimal contact or no contact. There's no right answer. But there's an inescapable truth. You cannot complete the process of individuation while you're still trying to be the clone that your parents want you to be. As Jung emphasized, individuation is about becoming a whole, separate individual, distinct from external influences. Sarah took 3 years to get to this point. 3 years of therapy, experimentation, reconstruction. And then she did something she'd never done. She disagreed with her mother. Publicly, it was about something small, politics, but her mother always declared, "We think this way," and Sarah always agreed silently, even when she didn't agree internally. This time, Sarah said calmly, "Actually, Mom, I think differently," and explained her position. Her mother was in shock, then furious, then cold, withdrew contact for 2 weeks, exactly the pattern that had worked for 35 years, to force Sarah back into conformity. But this time, Sarah didn't back down. She tolerated the panic, the guilt, the fear of abandonment, and waited. When her mother finally spoke to her again, something fundamental had changed. Sarah had proven to herself that she could survive. Her mother's disapproval, that existing separately, didn't mean death. That was the true separation. Not geographical, but psychological. For parents, how not to create emotional clones if you're a parent. And you're reading this with a heavy heart, asking if you're doing this to your children. Let me offer some good news. The fact that you're asking already means you're probably not a narcissistic parent. Narcissistic parents don't question, don't reflect, don't worry if they're destroying the individuality of their children. But all parents, even healthy ones, sometimes slip into cloning behaviors, especially when they're tired, stressed, or operating on autopilot. So here are 5 concrete practices that protect against creating emotional clones. Practice 1. Unconditional validation of internal reality. When your child says, "I feel sad," don't correct, don't minimize, don't explain why he shouldn't feel that way. Simply reflect, "You're feeling sad." That simple validation does 2 critical things. First, it confirms that his internal perception is real and reliable. Second, it establishes that he is a separate person, with his own emotional life that you respect. Practice 2. Genuine curiosity about who they're becoming. Instead of declaring who your child is, ask and really listen, without an agenda, without trying to mold the answer. What did you think of that? How did you feel? What do you want? And then, be quiet. Leave space for them to discover and articulate their own answers. That curiosity communicates, "I don't know who you are. You're revealing yourself, and I'm fascinated to discover." Practice 3. Celebration of difference. When your child expresses a preference, opinion, or choice different from yours, celebrate, even if internally. "You don't like it. You like green. That's interesting. I've always preferred blue, but green is a great choice. You have your own taste." This celebration of difference teaches that separation is safe, that being different from you doesn't mean losing your love. Practice 4. Permission to experiment and fail. Let your children make decisions, small ones at first, bigger ones over time, and let them experience the consequences. They chose to wear an outfit that you think is ugly. That's okay. They want to try a hobby that you think they won't like. Let them try. They're making choices that you made and regretted. Let them have their own experiences. Individuation requires freedom to err. If you protect too much, control too much, you impede the development of the self. Practice 5. conscious separation of your projections. This is the most difficult. You have to constantly examine, am I responding to my real child, or am I responding to a projection of my desires, fears, unfulfilled ambitions? When you're disappointed that he doesn't like football, is it because football is important to who he is, or because you wanted him to like it? When you push for certain grades, is it because he needs that, or because you need him to validate your choices, heal your wounds, realize your unlived dreams? This constant vigilance against projection is exhausting, but it's absolutely necessary, because emotional clones are created by parents who can't see their children as separate from themselves. This aligns with Jung's view on psychological projection, where we unconsciously attribute our own unacceptable qualities or emotions to others, hindering their true self-discovery. What happens when you reclaim the self? Let me finish by telling you what happened to Lisa. She walked into my office at 42 years old, completely empty. She didn't know who she was. She didn't know what she wanted. She had lived 42 years as a perfect copy of her mother. It took 4 years of painful, consistent, courageous work, of grief, of rage, of experimentation, of discovery, of confrontation. Today, at 46 years old, Sophia is unrecognizable, not externally, but energetically. There's substance where there was once emptiness. There's clarity where there was once confusion. There's life where there was once programming. She described it like this: I used to feel like I was watching my life happen. Now I feel like I'm living it. Every decision, even the small ones, comes from within, and that's scary sometimes, but it's also the most liberating thing I've ever felt. Sophia changed careers. She ended a marriage she never wanted. She moved to a different city. She developed hobbies her mother would never approve of. And yes, the relationship with her mother changed. It became more distant, more superficial. But Sophia doesn't care anymore, because she finally found something more important than her mother's approval. She found herself, and that's worth any price. If you're living as an emotional clone, know this: you are not doomed. The true self is there, waiting. You can start today. Small, an honest preference, an authentic opinion, a moment of refusal to echo automatically. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." If you were raised as a clone, that privilege was stolen from you, but you can reclaim it at any moment, at any age. As Jung so wisely observed, our journey of individuation, while often challenging, is fundamentally about returning to our authentic selves. The true self never dies. It only falls asleep, and it's waiting for you to wake it up.